Good news, everybody! I'll be talking about self-exploration and dragon slaying, but I'm not Jordan Peterson, so you're probably gonna be alright. Cheers! Welcome back, everybody, to Sunday School, the series of videos where I tell you how to read fantasy because clearly you can't do it on your own, which is, well, how I run this. Anyway, this is an ongoing series where I talk about different ways of reading fantasy, different lenses to reading fantasy that hopefully will give you more joy and bring you, ideas of how to read books and get more out of them. That's the goal here, and we've done several of those about the Fionavar tapestry by Guy Gavriel Kay, and then I got distracted by King Arthur, which happens from time to time, especially if someone like Guy Gavriel Kay puts an Arthur into his book, and that's where we left off with that long sidetrack, but we're back now talking about the Fionavar tapestry. This is basically the last part of this. We'll be talking about The Darkest Road, the final book, quickly. There will be spoilers for it, of course, and I'll also, point to some other things, because today we'll talk about philosophy and psychology as a way of interpreting and reading fantasy. So, where do we start with all of this? Well, with a bit of a history lesson, because I love to talk about the olden days. Now, one thing that is important to understand is that philosophy and parts of psychology that we're talking about today are very much related. See, psychology is one of the later parts of the sciences that split off of philosophy, mostly in the 19th century, with questions like intentionality and the likes, which is what's going on in our brains when we do the thinking stuff. And because we weren't really good at actually looking into brains and seeing all the bits and figuring out how that works, just like we're not exactly perfect at it today, to put it mildly, a lot of people did a lot of speculating and coming up with cool theories that have very little, well, explanation beyond I think it might work. And that's sort of where we start. See, psychology today, there's a lot of, closer to neuroscience, doing a lot of studies, doing medical stuff, and so forth. Back in the day, when people like our good buddy Sigmund Freud, yes, he's coming up, I'll not do dick jokes, hopefully, started doing this, it was much closer to philosophy. It was more imaginative, coming up with theories, about the id and the ego and the superego and stuff like that. Also, quick aside, in German it sounds so much better because Über-Ich sounds slightly Nazi, which will be fun when we get to our next buddy, which is obviously Carl Jung. Anyway, Sigmund Freud coming up with ideas like the id, the ego, and the superego, splitting up our personalities or our consciousness into these different aspects, is one of these theories. And when you look at it, that's much closer to how philosophers build theories than it is how, people in medicine would build theories nowadays. And that's one point why I feel that questions that we're talking about today are somewhere in that gray area between philosophy and psychology, or mostly psychoanalysis, in fact. So anyway, at the beginning of the 20th century, this becomes a bit of a boom, sort of. Freud becomes bigger with his psychoanalytic society, and one of his students is one Carl Jung, who has read a lot of Nietzsche and has weird ideas. And he studies under Freud, and they work together on stuff, and then they split up over things that we probably don't need to talk about today, but they're connected to the libido, because yes, this is a lot of dirty old men, especially Carl Jung, who loves to, get very physical with his patients, which is proper proper behavior for doctors in any way. However, Carl Jung comes up with another theory that comes after the splitting up the personality into the id, the ego, and the superego, and that is his idea of a subconscious, a collective subconscious. Now, his idea there is that, we all have sort of memories that go back ages and ages, and they are part of our collective subconscious, which may be expressed in myths. Put a pin into that, we'll come back to it. So that's his large contribution, one of them. Another one is that, in this subconscious, there are certain archetypes that make up our personality, our consciousness, and so forth. And well, this still sounds very metaphysical, right? We're more talking about like souls than we're actually talking about brains doing brain stuff. And this, as I said, is important to understand why we're somewhere in that area between philosophy and psychology. So Jung comes up with the idea of a collective subconscious, which kind of connects neatly to stuff that people like Fraser did in the 19th century, coming up with the idea that a lot of myths in all kinds of different parts of the world may be somewhat similar sometimes, and Jung has an idea why that is, which is, of course, well, his collective unconscious, subconscious. Now, does that make sense? I don't know. I guess the human experience in part is relatively similar no matter where you live, and some of these questions we all have to wrestle with and come up with, so there's probably something to it. In a bit of a branding issue, he does split off from Freud, they get really mad at each other, and Jung calls his part of psychology depth psychology. Now, does that make sense? Well, it's still not very psychology. He starts a bit of a cult in a lot of ways, but that's something we might get into in a very, very different video when we talk about Jung's cult and his connection to Nazis, because you knew it was going there, right? So yeah, that's Jung's contribution. He has a lot of fans already in the 20s and 30s, and one person that we need to talk about here before we get into what we're actually talking about is one Joseph Campbell, who also loves Nazis and loves Jung. And he writes a book which is obviously called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he comes up with an idea that ties the Jungian archetypes and stuff back into mythology. His idea is that there's basically only one story. It is the monomyth. And it is, well, full of these aspects. And he's like, this is what we find in all mythologies. He's wrong about that, of course, but, you know, he's an old white Nazi, and he does really only look at some myths that he really likes and builds his story out of that. There's more to it, but, you know, the main issue that is important here with Jungian psychology having an influence on Joseph Campbell is that a lot of people read Joseph Campbell. It's a very persuasive book, and you read it and you look at a lot of fiction and you look at a lot of mythology, you can see parts of his monomyth and the hero's journey, which is at the core of this monomyth, in there. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Well, a lot of fiction writers afterwards read Joseph Campbell and the monomyth and, well, consciously built their stories modeled them after the monomyth in a lot of ways. One person who's doing that very deliberately is one George Lucas, who writes a little film called Star Wars, and it basically is just, well, the hero's journey of a young hero being called to action, going out there into the darkness, doing things and bringing something back from his quest to better society, because that is at the core of the monomyth. We'll come back how that ties into what Jungian psychology also does in a moment. So with that, however, it is very clear the monomyth has arrived in modern fiction, whether it is true to begin with or not, because now it has been made true by everyone who read Campbell and then just like started writing stories in that mode. So this is how psychology, or what you might call psychology, especially Jungian psychology, kind of entered into fantasy and science fiction and fiction in general. There are also a few fantasy authors who are very deliberately fans of Jungian psychology, because once again, the idea of these archetypes lends itself to fantasy in a lot of ways, because fantasy often is somewhat allegorical and does use characters that are a bit of a stand-in, or they are archetypes, so you can do that. One author who does that, luckily because she's a brilliant author, it doesn't really great, is Ursula Le Guin. Another author who does sometimes play with that is Fritz Leiber, in books like Our Lady of Darkness. These Jungian archetypes kind of come in a way that are, well, they are there, is my point. So beyond just having read Campbell, a lot of fantasy authors are also fans of Jungian psychology to start with, which means that a lot of these ideas end up in our fantasy and science fiction. Now, there's one more thing that we need to talk about before we get to the darkest road, and that is the question of allegory. See, myth, and in a lot of ways, well, religious texts, which are very much myth, has always had an allegorical side to it. it has always generalized certain problems that humans are faced with. Questions of duty, questions of, well, freedom of will, those kind of things show up in mythology a lot, which leads to one J.R.R. Tolkien being very angry when he writes his thing that he patterns after myth, we call it The Lord of the Rings nowadays, to say very clearly it is not allegory. Now, why does he say that? Because he, well, it feels misrepresented by people who try to read Lord of the Rings as a very thinly veiled allegory or reworking of the events of World War II, which it is not. So I get his anger, but he kind of misses the point that there is obviously allegory in Lord of the Rings, because it does deal with these questions of duty, of freedom, and all of those kind of things, because it is patterned after mythology, and mythology has always dealt with these things. Now, one person who kind of understood that, sort of, is one Stephen R. Donaldson, who wrote the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. I've made videos about the first trilogy last year, and he also wrote some essays on the subject. One of them is free for you to find on his website, I think both are. And the other one is called Epic Fantasy, Necessary Literature, and it's also free on the internet. I'll try to link it down below if I don't forget. So what about that? See, Donaldson looks at Tolkien as like, of course there is some form of allegory, and the way Stephen R. Donaldson writes his epic fantasy is exactly that. He goes and says, well, the epic fantasy world, the realm that we imagine when we do secondary world building, is a representation of our mind, of the human soul, with all these aspects, these different species, and all of these things happening there, being sort of stand-ins or representations of, well, aspects of the human psyche. We might call those archetypes, but they're different in a lot of ways. They just can also explain very specific facets of a human going through certain aspects of their life. And that is very much what he does with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, at least with the first three, because, well, I haven't read the rest yet, so that's all I can speak to. In a lot of ways, characters and actions and the plot in these novels are an allegory for Thomas Covenant coming to terms with, or, well, failing to come to terms with, and wrestling with the problem of having a very terrible illness, terminal illness in this case, which is leprosy. And that can read sometimes a bit wooden. Now, what Donaldson does, which I think is correct in his assessment, is to say it's not just the, religious allegory where you have very clear stand-ins. What fantasy does, just by being very long and complicated tales from time to time with nuance and so forth, while still being somewhat allegorical, they add nuance to explore these thought processes, these questions of good and evil, freedom and restraint, all of these things. But it's akin to allegory. It's just a bit more nuanced because we have a larger page count, usually somewhere in the 1,000-page range when we're talking epic fantasy. And I think that's an important aspect, because what Donaldson hints at is that even though maybe some authors don't do this deliberately, it's always possible to read a story in the way that Donaldson says we can read it, and that Donaldson himself patterned and created his Thomas Covenant story like. So whether it is the correct, well, it's not the correct way, because there is no correct way to read a story, but it is always one approach that we can take. See the things happening in a story as stand-ins and as, well, a working through a problem in our human psyche, because they are all expressions of parts of the human condition. So now that we have all of this out of the way, let's look at Guy Gavriel Kay's The Darkest Road, which is the third book in the Fionavar tapestry. And it was published in the 1980s, so shortly after the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the first ones at least, and these first essays that people like Stephen R. Donaldson wrote on the matter. So we can assume that someone who worked with Tolkien and was part of the epic fantasy landscape at the time was aware of the things that Stephen R. Donaldson was doing there. So we can assume that these things may have had some impact on the writings of Guy Gavriel Kay in this case. Now, let's look at the topics that the whole series wrestles with, and that are possibly, and this is my claim, more explicit in this final book. And I think there's a reason why they are more explicit. See, one of the big topics in the final book is the question of free will. Do humans have free will and a free choice? Guy Gavriel Kay says, yes, we do. Because, and in his world correction, that is because of the wild hunt, allowing, well, freedom, because there is absolute randomness and chaos in the world, that allows, that means that even the creator, in his case, the weaver, does not know everything, and there are ways for humans to actually make meaningful choices. In fact, that's exactly what we can read out of this when it comes to the free will question, is that all of what we do as humans is having to face a fate that is out there, that may be out there and seem almost inevitable, but we always have a final choice. And the plot of Damien, Jessica's or Guinevere's son, is exactly that personified, right? He's set out to be as random as possible, which is why everyone kind of leaves him alone. And he works through all of these questions and makes that choice between light and dark in the end by sacrificing himself, and with that actually killing his father, Rakoth Malgrim. That's one question that this book deals with, the question of freedom of will. And having that in there, and making it very clear that it is always a possibility to just give in to inevitability. But this also is a choice. It's, for example, expressed once again with Kimberly, when she decides not to give in to the pressure of her war ring, the Baelrath, is that what it's called? Yeah, the ring, when she decides not to summon the crystal dragon to the battle. See, we're back to dragons already. When she decides not to do, she could have done so, and that's probably how fate would have worked, but humans can make a difference. Another case where that is what happens is when Djarmite decides to actually go into single combat with the huge monster, which is totally not the mouth of Sauron, but kinda is, to actually break free that very specific pattern of doom between Lancelot, Arthur, and Guinevere. Those are these instances where Guy Gavriel Kay kind of makes an argument for freedom of will over predetermination, which, yeah, that's a theological argument right there, and a philosophical one, and up to a point, a psychological one, when you look at all the people claiming that we don't have free will because of some neuroscience thing that is still not fully worked out. See, we're already reading this in a philosophical and psychological way. But there's more, of course. Another more philosophical aspect is what happens with the Paraiko, the giants, who are absolute pacifists. And you can read this, once again, very much in a Donaldson way, where you also have different species, different groups that have very specific aspects. And in fact, the giants are already very pacifist in a way in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. And here they're absolute pacifists. And they have to break out of that absolute pacifism to take part in that overall struggle between good and evil, which is what they do when Kimberly forces them to. And you can read that as a psychological aspect of having, all of us, I guess, do have that very specific pacifist urge. The way of, the urge to avoid any form of conflict, to never go into conflict and just be passive. And you can read this as an argument that Donaldson makes, that in absolute conflicts about good and evil, and all of existence at the end of the day comes down to these questions of being active and taking a stand, asserting our morality. That means we need to leave behind that absolute passivity, which is exactly what we can see in that plot thread. Another way of reading this, both as a philosophical argument against pacifism, but also, well, as a psychological one, as having to overcome our inner urge to, avoid conflict and assert ourselves. Another way of reading this, once again. And there's one final part that we need to look at, which I think ties it all back together. See, when I talked about the hero's journey, there's one thing I kind of didn't mention, which is that Jung as well looked at a form of therapy in a way where we all go dig into our subconscious and face our inner demons and so forth and come back out of that urge better people with a better understanding of ourselves. That's one aspect of Jungian depth psychology. And in that we do face a lot of these archetypes and have to come to terms with them. And Jung is aware of the fact that this can be highly traumatic and can be very dangerous because, facing your own traumas kind of sucks. sucks. You ever heard of shadow work? Yeah, that kind of stuff. Don't do it unless you know what you're doing, is my point here. However, that does parallel, and Campbell makes this very clear, that does parallel the hero's journey, which is usually you have a call to action. The hero is reluctant to do so. He leaves his community, his established place, goes into, oftentimes, the underworld, faces certain dangers, confronts himself, or, well, for Campbell it's usually himself, because Campbell is a bit of a sexist, well, not just a bit, but a huge sexist, and then comes back with something that does benefit himself. He comes back as a changed character, and that also benefits his community. And you can read this, once again, as a, well, mythological version of, the Jungian approach of going down into the depths of your own subconscious, facing these heroes, these dangers, these archetypes, and coming back a changed person. You can read it that way. And quest fantasy does the same kind of thing. And in fact, Guy Gavriel Kay does this very explicitly. Because all of our main characters leave their home community, in this case Toronto, go into a different world, Fionavar, and come back changed people, or don't come back. And in fact, a lot of them have to work through specific aspects of their life that are out there. Paul, for example, has to come to terms with the trauma of his ex-girlfriend Rachel dying. And he does so in a lot of ways, and we see him struggle through that with his ordeal on the summer tree. And even after that, he has to come to terms with the fact that he has a bit of a control issue and tries to over-control everything. He kind of loses that near the end and remains in Fionavar with Jael, the priestess. On another person is Dave Martinuke, who does have to overcome a lot of his standoffishness. He has problems with his father. There are issues with his father that are all there from the beginning. And he kind of works through those by, well, gaining self-confidence, figuring out how to let go of parts of his standoffishness, joining, well, community with other people, appreciating them, and being appreciated, something that his father apparently never really knew how to show him. And he comes back a changed man, even asking out Kimberly for a date, basically, at the end. So there's that. And every character in this story, of the 5 human characters, at least, from the start, everyone has some part of themselves that they change when they're on this quest and come back. And each of those are very much topics and oftentimes issues that you would go through to therapy for. So the hero's journey that each of these people goes through does, in fact, do both. It's a hero's journey that saves the world. It's also a internal journey that saves themselves and turns themselves into better human beings. And I think this is deliberate and does tie back to what we said earlier about these different layers of fantasy when I talked about Fionavar Tapestry. In the first book, it's mostly a fantasy story that is very much like Lord of the Rings, and it connects to a lot of different references of other fantasy stories. It finds a common language that fantasy readers already have. In the second layer, we'll boil this down and see that a lot of fantasy is inspired by mythology, because mythology is in fact a bit of a common language that a lot of us use to, dock onto to then create new fiction, because no tale is ever started out of nothing. So we peel back one layer and we end up on a mythological layer. And in the third layer, we actually down there in the soul, in the psyche, where these issues about free will, about pacifism versus aggressiveness, all of these aspects of the human psyche, where they are, which may or may not be, well, the foundation for mythology. And we solve these issues down there in the collective subconscious of the third book, to then come back, or don't come back, let's not forget that, changed people, better people at the end of the day, out of our personal hero's journey through the mythological layer, when the Arthurian triangle between Lancelot and Guinevere and Arthur is actually solved by them 3 going off together, which is a really nice way of ending that, I guess, a very harmonious way. And when all of these issues are closed off and we kind of ascend back from that lowest level of our inner psyche through the mythological level all the way up to, well, at least 2 of our 5 people returning to Toronto, 1 person remaining in Fionavar, that being Paul, and 2 persons leaving, those being Kevin and Guinevere, which, once again, that form of self-exploration is dangerous, and it can, cause harm, and Guy Gavriel Kay does not shy away from that. So what have we learned today? Well, I've laid out one specific way of reading the Fionavar tapestry, or also fantasy in general, which is seeing fantasy worlds as a representation of our inner landscape, of our inner psyche, to deal with problems that are either personal trauma or aspects of philosophy, of how we see the world. When I say philosophy, I mean moral philosophy and ethics in this case. There's other aspects of philosophy that are harder to explain in fantasy novels, I assume, but with the ethics, it works fairly well. And I think that's one way that I wanted to show how we can read fantasy, and maybe it'll help you. Maybe you'll see a lot of our books in different ways now, and if so, I'm glad. If not, you've at least heard me make tell you some stories about Jung and Freud, and not making any dick jokes, which is good, I guess. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed all of this. Let me know what you think about it. I'll be moving on with Tigana as our next Guy Gavriel Kay novel to talk about. Until then, I hope you had a good time. If you want to talk about it, there's comments down there. I really appreciate those. Maybe like, maybe subscribe if you haven't. Maybe share it with someone. And if you feel like helping me out or being very thankful, there's some links down there where you can give me money, because it all boils down to money. Unfortunately, I do really appreciate that as well. There's a Patreon, there's a GoFundMe, there's a PayPal, those kind of things. But if you can't or don't want to, that's fine as well. Just, well, take something away from this video. And I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.